In the autumn of 1994, in a quiet community in Illinois, a young woman vanished without warning. Police found no evidence, and the case went cold almost overnight. More than 24 years later, one small detail reopened it. What investigators found didn't just solve a mystery, it exposed a secret no one could have imagined. Oak Creek was the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. A picturesque suburb an hour outside Chicago, its streets lined with tall oaks that turned brilliant gold and red every autumn. Neat houses, wide front porches, neighbors who knew each other by name. People left their doors unlocked in the daytime. Kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. It was safe, predictable, the last place on earth you'd expect a nightmare to unfold. At the center of that quiet community lived Clara and Richard Vance. On paper, they had it all. Richard was 28, a successful architect at a firm in the city, handsome, polite, well-liked on the street. Clara was 25, warm brown eyes, a smile that put people instantly at ease. She taught kindergarten at the local elementary school, known for her endless patience and her gentle voice. To the outside world, their life was suburban perfection. Behind closed doors, it was something heavier. For 4 years, they'd been trying to start a family, and they'd endured 2 miscarriages along the way, losses that left the house wrapped in a quiet, lingering sadness. Then, in the spring of 1994, everything changed. Clara was pregnant again, and this time, it held. Weeks turned into months. The doctor confirmed both mother and baby were healthy. A little girl. By November, Clara was 8 months along and glowing, the shadow that had followed her for years finally gone. She'd taken early leave from teaching to nest decorating the nursery, knitting small blankets, spending long afternoons in the white rocking chair by the window with her hands on her belly, feeling the baby kick. Richard had painted the nursery walls a soft, cheerful yellow. A hand-carved wooden crib sat in the corner, filled with white blankets and a small stuffed bear. Everything, finally, was falling into place. Tuesday, November 14, 1994, started like any other day. The weather had turned bitterly cold overnight, gray clouds hanging low, the local stations forecasting the season's first major snowstorm. At 7 that morning, Richard kissed Clara goodbye, a 2-day corporate retreat downtown, mandatory for the firm's partners. Clara walked him to the door in her woolen bathrobe, warned him to drive safe, and watched from the porch as his car disappeared down the street. The morning passed quietly. At 9, Clara walked to the end of the driveway for the paper. A neighbor, elderly Mrs. Gable, was out with her dog and waved from across the street. They exchanged a few words about the cold. Mrs. Gable would later tell police Clara looked entirely normal, happy even at noon. The snow started light flurries at first, quickly turning into a heavy, blinding fall. Wind howled through the oaks, rattling windows. The streets emptied as everyone hunkered down by their fireplaces. At 3:15, Clara called her mother Helen, who lived about 45 minutes away. They talked almost daily. It was an entirely ordinary conversation, Clara making chicken soup, glad to be warm inside during the storm, the two of them going back and forth between the names Lily and Charlotte for the baby. She was so happy, Helen would later say, her voice breaking. There was nothing wrong, it was just a normal Tuesday afternoon. At 3:42, that normal afternoon stopped cold. Mid-sentence, Clara cut in. "Hold on, Mom." Her voice wasn't scared, just mildly curious. "Someone's knocking at the front door." "Who is it in this weather?" Helen asked. "I don't know. Let me go check. Hold on, don't hang up." Helen heard the receiver set down on the counter, footsteps moving away toward the front hallway. The faint squeak of the door hinges opening. Then, nothing. 1 minute passed. 2. Helen called her daughter's name into the phone. No answer, just the faint, distant hum of an open line. At 5 minutes, a knot of worry started forming in her stomach. She told herself Clara was talking to a delivery driver or a neighbor needing help with a driveway. At 10 minutes, that knot turned into real fear. Clara picked up the phone. Silence. At 15 minutes, the line disconnected with a sharp click. Someone or something had hung it up. Helen called back immediately. It rang and rang. No answer, no machine. She called Richard's office in Chicago. The receptionist said he was in a closed-door seminar and couldn't be pulled out. Desperate, Helen flipped through her address book and called Clara's next-door neighbor, Martha Evans. "Martha, it's Helen, Clara's mother. I was just on the phone with her. She went to answer the door and never came back. It just hung up. Can you go check on her? Please." Martha threw on her winter coat and boots and made her way through the snow toward the Vance house. As she approached, she froze. The front door stood wide open, swinging slightly in the wind, cold air pouring into the hallway. "Clara?" No answer. She stepped inside. Snow had already drifted onto the hardwood just past the threshold. In the kitchen, the scene made her blood run cold. The phone receiver hung off the counter, swinging on its cord. On the stove, a pot of chicken soup boiled violently, spilling over the sides, hissing against the burner. Martha shut it off, then ran through the house living room, bathrooms, the master bedroom, the yellow nursery. Empty, all of it. Clara was gone. Martha grabbed the dangling phone and dialed 911. Officer Miller was first through the door. 10 minutes later, sirens cutting through the storm. He found Martha in the kitchen, shaking, and got the story: the phone call, the open door, the boiling pot. He and his partner swept the house. No struggle, nothing broken or overturned. The house was perfectly neat. But the details that emerged didn't add up. Clara's heavy winter coat still hung by the door, scarf and gloves tucked in the pockets. Her boots sat exactly where they always did. Every pair of shoes in the house accounted for. On the kitchen counter, inches from the dangling phone, sat her purse wallet, license, credit cards, house keys, untouched inside. Clara Vance was 25 years old, 8 months pregnant, and a blizzard was dropping temperatures below freezing outside. She hadn't packed a bag, hadn't taken her keys, her money, her coat, hadn't even put on shoes. She'd answered a knock on a normal Tuesday afternoon, phone still in hand, and simply vanished into a whiteout, apparently barefoot. Or she hadn't walked out at all. Miller stepped onto the front porch and looked down at the fresh, undisturbed snow on the walkway. There were no footprints leading away from the house. How does a heavily pregnant woman disappear from her own home? No coat, no shoes, no keys, door open, stove boiling over without leaving a single print in the snow? In any missing person case, the first 48 hours are critical. With a pregnant woman in freezing temperatures, that clock moves 10 times faster. Miller called for backup immediately. Within half an hour, cruisers lit up the street. Search and rescue was mobilizing, and K9 units were brought in. A handler led a German shepherd scent one of Clara's sweaters. The dog worked the hallway, moved out onto the porch and stopped, circling and whining. No trail to follow. Either the storm had erased it, or, as the handler grimly suggested, Clara had never set foot on the ground at all. Meanwhile, 2 Chicago officers pulled Richard out of his retreat and told him his pregnant wife was missing. Co-workers later described him collapsing on the spot, a coffee mug shattering on the marble floor, his knees buckling, sobbing so hard the officers had to help him walk. He was in no state to drive. Back at the station, despite his devastation, investigators had to run the standard playbook. In cases where a pregnant woman disappears, the husband is statistically the first suspect. They questioned him hard: the marriage, any arguments, any insurance policies. But Richard's alibi was airtight. Signed in at the hotel at 9 that morning. 15 executives confirmed he'd been in the same conference room from 1 to 5. Security footage caught him in the hallways on breaks. With the highway a parking lot from the storm, There was no possible window for him to have left, driven the 45 minutes home, and returned unnoticed. He was cleared completely. By Thursday, the storm broke, and the town mobilized hundreds of volunteers in heavy parkas, walking search lines through parks, woods, and the frozen riverbank, poking long poles into snowdrifts. Helen appeared on the local news, exhausted, holding up a photo of Clara at her baby shower. "If someone has my daughter," she said, voice cracking, "please just let her go. She's due any day. She needs to be in a hospital. Please bring my little girl home." No ransom note ever came, no demand for money, no tip led anywhere. Clara had simply ceased to exist. 3 days later, the temperature rose enough for the snow to start melting, and a technician doing a secondary sweep of the front yard found something buried beneath the receding bank's deep, heavy indentations carved into the mud. Tire tracks. Not from the driveway. A heavy vehicle, a van or a large truck, had driven off the paved road, straight across the lawn, and reversed all the way up to the porch. The rear tires had stopped less than 2 feet from the steps. That solved the mystery of the missing footprints. Whoever came to the door hadn't marched Clara down the driveway. The vehicle had already been backed up against the porch. She'd been pulled straight from the house into the back of it in a matter of seconds. That explained the untouched house, the dangling phone, the boiling soup. It was targeted. Someone knew she'd be alone. Someone knew the storm would cover their tracks. But who? Weeks turned into months. Christmas lights went up around a town that felt hollow. Inside the Vance house, the yellow nursery sat gathering dust, blankets still folded. Richard couldn't stand to live there. Clara's perfume still lingered in the bathroom. Her handwriting still on the grocery list, stuck to the fridge. After a month, he moved into his parents' house 2 towns over. By the new year, the department had chased every lead, every neighbor, co-worker, parent of a student Clara had taught. No enemies, no jealous exes. Nothing. Detective Miller, the lead on the case, decided to pull Clara's life apart from the inside medical records, financial statements. Every call to or from the house in the 6 months before she disappeared. Running the phone log from the day of the vanishing, he found something small but strange. 3 minutes before Helen's call, at 3:12 p.m., Clara had answered an 18-second call from a payphone outside a gas station just 4 blocks from her house. Someone had stood in the blizzard, called to confirm she was home, hung up 18 seconds later, and driven straight over. Detectives found the gas station cashier who'd been working that afternoon. He remembered someone using the outdoor phone in a blizzard, a woman, in a heavy dark coat with the hood up, on the line for only seconds before getting into a dark blue car and driving off toward the neighborhood. A woman. Trying to understand the pregnancy angle, Miller drove to interview Clara's longtime obstetrician, Dr. Harris, a soft-spoken older man who delivered hundreds of local babies. When Miller asked about Clara's 8-month pregnancy, Dr. Harris looked at him, confused. "I don't understand," he said. "Why is everyone saying she was 8 months pregnant? I haven't seen her since early September." She called and canceled all her remaining appointments, said she was switching to another doctor, but wouldn't say who. Miller stared. "Her husband told us he dropped her off here every 2 weeks, right at your door." "If he was dropping her off," Harris said, "she never came inside. We haven't treated her in over 2 months." Clara had been lying to her husband, to her mother, to everyone. Detectives pulled the clinic's old VHS lobby footage, and after hours of fast-forwarding, found October 14th, a Tuesday morning. Richard's silver car pulled up. Clara stepped out, smiled, waved, and walked through the sliding doors as his car pulled away. Then, on camera, she just stood in the lobby. 30 seconds. She never approached the desk. Her smile faded into something cold and calculating. She checked over her shoulder to make sure Richard's car was truly gone, then turned around and walked straight back out. 2 minutes later, An unmarked dark blue sedan pulled up to the exact spot her husband's car had just left. Clara got in without hesitation. It drove away. She hadn't been going to a doctor's appointment. She'd been going somewhere else entirely, and whoever was driving that car held the key to what she'd been hiding. Time did what it always does. The snow melted into spring, spring into summer, and the years began to stack. The flyers on Oak Creek's telephone poles curled and blew away. The house was sold. The new owners painted over the yellow nursery and threw out the crib. Richard held on for 5 years before finally packing up and moving to Arizona, rarely speaking of Oak Creek again. Helen never left, kept paying the phone bill, kept the same landline number, kept Clara's winter coat hanging by the door, just in case. She died in a nursing home in the winter of 2012, 18 years after the blizzard, spending her final days watching the snow fall and whispering her daughter's name. The case went formally cold. Boxes of files went into a dusty corner of the evidence room, but one man never let it go. By 2018, Detective Miller was in his late 60s, retired a decade earlier, hair gone entirely white, but he'd kept photocopies of the whole file and built a corkboard in his basement, staring most nights at the grainy photo of Clara climbing into that dark blue sedan. He knew the answer was in that car. He just had no way to find it. Then, on a cold, rainy morning in November 2018, a young investigator named Detective Reed got a call at the Oak Creek precinct from a medical administrator at Mercy General Hospital in Chicago. The hospital was digitizing decades of old paper records before destroying the originals, and the scanning software cross-checked names against a national database. That morning, it had thrown a red flag, a file belonging to a patient named Clara Vance. Social Security number, an exact match for the missing woman from Oak Creek. Reed called Miller directly. Miller dropped his coffee mug on the kitchen floor and was dressed and in the car within 20 minutes. They drove to Chicago together, mostly in silence. In the hospital's sub-basement archive, endless rows of metal filing cabinets. The smell of old paper, an archivist handed them a single thin manila folder. "I pulled it as soon as the system flagged the name," she said. "I thought you needed to see this." Miller's hands shook as he opened it. The first page was an ER intake form, dated September 14, 1994, exactly 2 months before the disappearance. Clara had been brought in by ambulance, found collapsed in a rest stop bathroom outside the city. The signature at the bottom was unmistakably hers. The next document was a surgical pathology report. Clara had suffered a catastrophic late-term miscarriage, internal bleeding, so severe that surgeons had performed an emergency hysterectomy to save her life. Miller read the doctor's final note out loud, barely above a whisper. Patient informed of surgical outcome. Patient advised she will no longer be able to conceive or carry a child. The room went dead silent. When Clara vanished on November 14th, Richard swore she was 8 months pregnant, said he'd felt the baby kick. Helen had been sewing blankets. Neighbors had seen her walking, visibly pregnant. The whole town believed a baby was coming, but the record on the table said that was medically impossible. Clara had lost the baby on September 14th, the same week she'd abruptly canceled her prenatal appointments and could never carry a child again. For 2 months, she had lived a total lie. Come home, looked her husband in the eye, and kept pretending a prosthetic belly under her maternity sweaters, faked kicks, faked joy, sitting in that yellow nursery rocking a chair for a baby that no longer existed. The whole town was looking for a pregnant woman, Reed said, stunned. We were all looking for something that didn't exist. If she wasn't pregnant, the entire foundation of the case for 24 years had been built on a lie. She hadn't been targeted for her vulnerability, so why had she gotten into that dark blue sedan a month later? Miller pulled out the old photocopy of the clinic surveillance still and studied the driver of the blue car through a magnifying glass, a detail he'd looked past 1,000 times, always filtered through the assumption that Clara was the pregnant victim. The driver was leaning awkwardly to the side, the steering wheel pressed tight against her body. The driver of the blue car was pregnant. Clara hadn't been the victim of a baby thief. Clara had been hunting for a baby of her own. The drive back to Oak Creek was quiet, both men absorbing the reversal. If Clara was faking a pregnancy and had been photographed getting into a car driven by a pregnant stranger, it meant she'd been trying to acquire a child before her husband and mother found out the truth. Somewhere in that arrangement, the plan had collapsed, and the predator had become the target. Reed pulled the state's historical vehicle database and filtered for dark blue four-door sedans registered in the Tri-County area between 1990 and 1994. Owners female. Born 1970 to 1975, matching the driver's approximate age. 400 results. Too broad. Miller had another idea. Cross-reference with county health department records from that autumn. Look for anyone on that list flagged for state prenatal care, or listed as an unwed expectant mother. If Clara was hunting for a baby, she'd have gone for someone vulnerable, not a wealthy family with private doctors. The list shrank to a single name, a 1989 dark blue Chevy Celebrity, registered to a 20-year-old named Evelyn Mercer, of Elgin, Illinois, a blue-collar town 30 miles north of Oak Creek. Evelyn's file matched perfectly. Dropped out of high school, unmarried, cut off from family, broke. A public clinic visit in August 1994 confirmed she was 5 months along, due in late November. And then the detail that made Miller's blood run cold. In October 1994, her older brother, Ray Mercer, had moved into her trailer to help with rent. 26 years old, a drywall contractor and heavy machinery operator. His work vehicle, a 1992 GMC Sierra pickup, dual rear tires. The exact match for the tire tracks on Clara's front lawn. "We have the connection," Reed said. The sedan belonged to the sister. The truck that backed up to the porch belonged to the brother. A records pull confirmed it. On November 20th, 1994, 6 days after Clara vanished, Ray Mercer had walked into a bank in Elgin and deposited $15,000 in cash. The next day, he'd paid off his truck loan and cleared his back rent. Miller remembered a detail that had always nagged at him in October 1994. Clara had withdrawn $20,000 from her and Richard's joint savings. She'd explained it away as costs for a private midwife and imported nursery furniture. Richard, trusting her completely, never questioned it, never checked the receipt. She hadn't been paying a midwife. She'd been paying for a baby. But that raised the real question. If this was simply a cash transaction, why did it end with Ray Mercer driving through a killer blizzard to Clara's house? And why did Clara vanish, barefoot, without a trace? A search of records showed Evelyn Mercer had died in 2002 at 28 from liver failure. She could tell them nothing. But Ray was still alive, 71 now, living alone in a cabin outside Effingham, deep in rural southern Illinois. "Get the keys," Miller said. "We're driving to Effingham." The 3-hour drive south took them out of the Chicago sprawl and into flat, harvested cornfields under a low, cold fog. Neither man spoke much. Miller thought about Richard, still believing his pregnant wife had been stolen by a monster. He thought about Helen, dying in that nursing home, never knowing her daughter had been living a double life. They found the cabin at the end of 2 miles of gravel road, weathered wood, a moss-covered roof, and beside the porch, sunk into the grass, the rusted, rotted frame of a 1992 GMC Sierra. An old man answered the door, thick white beard, a stained flannel shirt, leaning on a cane. When his eyes moved from Reed's badge to Miller's face, something in his expression collapsed. "Ray Mercer," Reed said. "We need to talk about November 1994. About Clara Vance." Ray's shoulders sank. "I wondered when the day would come," he said, voice dry and raspy. "I knew it would eventually. You can't keep something like that buried forever." He led them inside, sat heavily in a worn recliner, and lit a cigarette with shaking hands. Miller laid the evidence out on the coffee table: the tire tracks, the bank deposit, The clinic photo, the hospital records. We know it all, Ray. We know Clara wasn't pregnant. We know she was buying your sister's baby. We know she paid you $15,000, and your truck was on her lawn the day she vanished. I spent 24 years looking for her body. Tell me what you did. Ray covered his face. We didn't kill her. He wept. I swear on my sister's grave. It was supposed to be a simple handoff. Take the rest of the money, give her the baby when it came. Then why the truck in that blizzard? Miller pressed. Why did she leave the house barefoot and never come back? Ray lowered his hands, eyes bloodshot. Because the deal changed. Evelyn was having second thoughts. She'd started to love the baby. She wanted to keep it. She tried to give the deposit back. But Clara wouldn't take it. She'd already built the nursery, already told her husband. She said she'd rather die than let anyone find out she'd lied. That afternoon, Clara called our trailer from a pay phone, hysterical. Saeed, if we didn't bring the baby right then, she'd kill herself and blame us for it. She was completely unhinged. We took the truck because the car couldn't handle the drifts. Evelyn went to the corner pay phone to call ahead, tell her we were outside, that we were just leaving the money on the porch. But Clara didn't wait. She ran out into the snow with no shoes, no coat, straight to the truck, and forced her way into the cab. Ray's hands gripped the arms of the chair. She was hysterical. Evelyn got back in beside her, and Clara just snapped. Grabbed something heavy off the dash, a paperweight, I think smashed the window, started clawing at Evelyn's stomach, screaming that the baby was hers. She was trying to hurt her. His voice broke. I was driving. I had to protect Evelyn, the baby. I grabbed a wrench off the console. I just wanted to knock Clara out, make her stop screaming. I swung it in the dark, in the middle of the storm. Hit her in the side of the head. His voice dropped to almost nothing. She went limp. She died instantly. It was an accident. I swear to God, it was an accident. We sat there in that freezing truck, covered in blood, realizing what had just happened. I knew nobody would believe it wasn't murder. So I took her. Where? Miller asked quietly. Did you bury her? I was a concrete contractor, Ray said. Hollow. Next morning, before the snow even melted, I drove to a job site in Elgin. We were pouring the foundation for a new warehouse. I put her in the deepest part of the trench and poured 10 tons of concrete over her. She's been under that floor for 24 years. Reed read him his rights. Ray didn't resist, just held out his wrists, looking, if anything, relieved. The burden he'd carried for half his life was finally off his shoulders. Within 48 hours, an excavation team broke through the warehouse floor at the exact spot Ray had described. 7 feet down, they found Clara Vance's remains. When the story broke, the whole state reeled. The kindergarten teacher they'd mourned for 24 years hadn't been a victim of some random predator. She'd been the architect of a plot to steal a child. But there was one more thread to pull. Before he left, Ray had handed over a green metal toolbox he'd kept hidden under the cabin floorboards, Clara's mud-stained bathrobe, a torn prosthetic belly, and a small micro-cassette recorder labeled, in Clara's own handwriting, the agreement. The tape captured the last minutes of the confrontation, the wind, the shouting, Clara's voice cracking with fury. You don't understand, it's too late to back out. Richard knows. He found the letters. Evelyn's voice, terrified, begging her to let go. Clara screaming that the baby belonged to her, that she'd tell Richard the truth about what we did in Chicago if Evelyn didn't hand the baby over. Then, breaking glass. A scream. A heavy thud and silence. It was Ray's own account afterward that filled in what the tape alone couldn't explain. Evelyn hadn't been a stranger Clara found at random. She'd worked as a cocktail waitress at the same downtown Chicago hotel where Richard's firm held its corporate retreats. In February 1994, Richard and Evelyn had a brief affair, just a handful of nights, and Evelyn got pregnant. Scared and broke, She'd written Richard a letter that April and driven to Oak Creek to leave it in his mailbox. Richard never found that letter. Clara did. Clara had confronted Evelyn, directly offered her cash to disappear and never contact Richard again. Evelyn agreed. But weeks later, Clara discovered she was pregnant herself. A real pregnancy. And for the rest of that summer, believing her own miracle had finally arrived, she left Evelyn alone. Then came September, and the miscarriage, and the hysterectomy, and the unbearable knowledge that her husband's mistress was still out there, carrying his actual biological child, while Clara herself would never carry one again. That was when the fake pregnancy began. In October, Clara went back to Evelyn with $20,000 and a plan. Fake the final weeks of the pregnancy, take the baby the moment it was born, and present it to Richard as their own. He would never know the child he was raising was his, just not Clara's. As Evelyn's due date closed in, as she felt the baby moving, she got attached and tried to back out. Clara, who'd already painted the nursery, already told the whole town, already worn the prosthetic for 2 months, couldn't let that happen. On the day of the blizzard, it all came apart in the front seat of a truck. The resolution moved fast after that. Detectives flew to Arizona to tell Richard, now in his 50s, that his wife had never been pregnant, that she'd been buying a baby, and that the baby had belonged to a woman he'd slept with in Chicago. He collapsed, completely grieving not just the wife he'd lost, but the realization that his own affair had set off the entire chain of events. He'd spent 2 decades hunting ghosts, never knowing he was the one who'd let them in. There was at least one piece of quiet grace in the story. Evelyn Mercer survived the blizzard. 2 weeks after Clara died, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl and kept her raised her alone, working 3 jobs, never telling her about the man in Oak Creek or the night in the storm. When Evelyn died in 2002, Ray quietly watched over the girl until she was grown. Today, that child is a 30-year-old woman, with a family of her own, living an ordinary, quiet life, with no idea that before she was even born, a grieving, broken woman had once tried to take her, and in doing so, became one of the most infamous missing person cases in the country. In the end, the story of Clara Vance isn't just a mystery about a disappearance. It's a reminder of what secrets can do left alone in the dark, how one lie, told to bury a painful truth, can grow into something that consumes everyone it touches. The snow always melts eventually, and the truth, no matter how many tons of concrete get poured over it, has a way of finding the surface even if it takes 24 years.